Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I'm here to talk about some of the books I've been reading recently, and I have to say my summer reading this year was pretty shit for a couple of reasons. The first being some more macro life stuff that has just been fairly time-consuming and kind of draining, and the second being that I spent most of June and July watching Love Island, which is the very popular UK reality show that is, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, the greatest show of all time. But it also airs 6 nights a week for 8 weeks straight, which is roughly 50 hours of television. So yeah, it's not for the faint of heart, and my reading life definitely took a big hit while it was on. But you know, no regrets, and I have been slowly getting back into the swing of things reading-wise and do have a handful of books to talk about today, so let's get right into it. And I thought I would start with 2 books that both got a lot of buzz this summer, but that were, in my opinion, extremely overhyped. And the first and more egregious of those 2 is 3 Women by Lisa Taddeo. 3 Women follows, perhaps unsurprisingly, 3 American women. The first is Maggie, a North Dakota woman who, as a teenager, had an affair with one of her high school teachers. The second is Lena, a Midwestern housewife stuck in a sexless marriage who rekindles things with an old flame. And the third is Sloane, a glamorous Newport restaurateur whose husband likes to watch her have sex with other people. And to be fair, this is an immensely readable book, in part because Lisa Taddeo does have a gift for detail and drawing a vivid scene, but also because the subject matter creates this natural sense of voyeurism for the reader. A voyeurism that veers kind of wildly from the exhilaration of peeping into your swinger's neighbor's bedroom window to, on the other hand, the kind of ripped from the small town headlines horror of statutory rape. But despite the compelling storytelling, what ultimately makes this an incredibly frustrating read is Lisa Taddeo's absolute failure to make any kind of argument or draw any kinds of conclusions or even connections between these 3 women's stories. In her introduction and conclusion, Lisa Taddeo writes about how this is a book about female desire, but female desire is not a thesis in itself, it is a topic, and even on that end of things, I think that calling this a book about female desire is a total simplification and at times even a misidentification of what's actually going on in these women's lives. I would say that more often than not, these are stories about female exploitation and manipulation and disappointment. And even if you do want to look at it through that lens of desire, I would say that these are stories about the incredibly fraught social and sexual and gender dynamics that are often at play when male and female desires collide, and how the desires of women are sometimes warped by or forced to capitulate to the desires of men. So there is a lot to potentially delve into here, but Taddeo neglects all of that nuance and all of those through lines and all of those interesting layers in favor of reducing everything to that base subject of female desire. To take another narrative nonfiction book as an example, can you imagine if Truman Capote, throughout In Cold Blood, was describing all of these events and scenes and people that are so rich and ripe for interpretation, and then at the end of all of it was like, it's about murder. Like, that's how useless Lisa Taddeo's quote-unquote thesis of this book is. And while it's fair enough to say that it's impossible to draw any broad or universal conclusions from a sample size of 3 American women, all of them white, 2 of them Catholic, for a book that is supposedly the product of more than 10 years of research and interviews, it's frustrating that Lisa Taddeo doesn't even try to make any kind of interpretation, or at least shore up all of her anecdotal evidence and material with some more rigorous supplementary research or journalism. So yeah, this book was a massive disappointment, and I think it's getting a lot of cheap points for being provocative and sexually frank and about women's narratives, but at the end of the day, I think it's an incredibly flimsy and shallow read. And my other buzzy but disappointing summer read was Fleischmann is in Trouble by Taffy, Brodesser-Akner. This book seemed to be the literary summer read of 2019, at least according to many New York book critics, and so it may come as little surprise that this is a book about divorce and middle-aged Manhattanites who make well over 6 figures and and still find ways to be completely miserable people. Specifically, this is the story of Toby Fleischmann, a 40-something, 5'5" doctor and father of two, who is exploring and indulging in all the carnal pleasures of modern dating apps when his high-strung and highly successful ex-wife Rachel suddenly disappears, leaving him to juggle the sudden demands of single parenthood with his string of one-night stands. And I do want to say that I don't think that books about the marital and financial angst of upper middle class people who voluntarily choose to live in New York are by nature dull and exhausting, but this one definitely was. It is possible that the only rich, miserable New Yorkers I want to read about are Edith Wharton's. Toby Fleischmann as a person and as a character is just insufferable, and not an interesting kind of insufferable. He's literally just a self-involved, chauvinistic asshole. And sadly, nothing about the way that Taffy Akner tells this story offers enough to make it worth sitting through these characters' misery and self-pity. If she's trying to be satirical, especially with the dating app stuff, nothing is sharp or consistent enough to set a proper tone throughout. Similarly, the social commentary throughout the book to me felt very obvious and unoriginal, like, wow, another middle-aged dad complaining about how kids use Instagram. And the writing itself just feels very dense and in desperate need of some editing, and I actually think that that exposition-heavy style of Akner's is far better suited to the celebrity profiles that made her famous, and less so to a novel where it just makes the story kind of drag on and on. And some mild spoilers ahead, but I think that what a lot of people are loving about this book, if they do love this book, is the very last section, which flips the script in a way that I suppose qualifies as a kind of twist, but is basically just there to say, I know Toby complains a lot and seems like a dick, but surprise, everything's worse for women. Which, like, no fucking duh, as if you couldn't have guessed that from like the first 10 pages of the book. And I guess I just don't think it's particularly clever or effective to spend 80% of a book with a transparently awful man in order to, at the end of it all, make a point about what it's like to be a woman. I just really don't think it's kind of worth your time, although I have heard from a number of married and divorced people that this book really gets it and is really on point. So if you fall into one of those categories and enjoyed this book and have a different take on it, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Another sadly underwhelming read was Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion, which I read a while back with Matthew Sharapa, and if you've been around this channel for a while, you may know that I am a massive fan of Joan Didion's nonfiction, but this was my first time reading any of her fiction, and it was not my favorite. This novel was published in 1970 and follows Mariah Wyeth, who is a 36-year-old past her prime Hollywood actress who we find recovering in a psychiatric hospital at the beginning of the book. And from there, the story is kind of strung together with these fragmentary vignette-like scenes of the events leading up to her mental break. And those scenes shift back and forth from Hollywood to New York to the desert that lies out somewhere between LA and Las Vegas. And what's interesting about this novel is that it was written between Slouching Towards Bethlehem and The White Album, which in my opinion are two of Joan Didion's best books. And in so many ways, so much of the writing in Play It As It Lays is so distinctly Joan Didion. It's precise and intense and a little bit cold. It's a book about California and the American West and anxieties about rattlesnakes, and has that insidery, name-droppy, West Coast waspy quality that can rankle at times, but that is also present in almost all of Joan Didion's writing. And yet, despite all those similarities in style and subject matter, Play It As It Lays has so much less substance than Joan Didion's nonfiction and essays. And I think that's because, apart from her absolute command of language and style, Joan Didion's real strength is in observation, the way that she watches and listens and methodically gathers information and data and then distills it down into something so pristine and perceptive that only she could have written it. And I think that kind of eagle-eyed observation is far better suited to her essays and journalism, where she can afford to kind of stand back half a step removed from her subject matter and take in the whole scope of things, or even in her memoirs where she can turn that quiet, searing lens on herself. And in fiction, it just doesn't seem to work quite quite as well or as effectively, and I think Didion might be one of those writers who's just far better at working with existing material rather than spinning her own story completely from scratch. So yeah, I don't really recommend this book unless you're a Didion fan and are interested in reading it as kind of a text in her greater oeuvre. But finally, moving on to something a little more positive, I have Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Radden Keefe, which came out earlier this year and tells a story about Northern Ireland during the Troubles by following two interconnected narratives. The first thread follows the 1972 disappearance of Belfast widow and mother of 10 Jean McConville, who was taken from her apartment complex at gunpoint one night and never heard from again. And the second thread follows some of the young, prominent members of the IRA, including Dolores Price, who in her early 20s participated in several high-profile car bombings and hunger strikes in the name of Irish independence. And I've heard a lot of people praise this book as reading like fiction, but instead of a book like Three Women, which actually does read like fiction because of a lack of reporting and journalistic infrastructure, I would say that this book instead reads like a really compelling blend of social and political history, investigative journalism, and true crime. And I think it's that true crime element in particular that gives this book a kind of intrigue and mystery and a sense of narrative momentum that people don't always expect from nonfiction. I picked up this book straight after reading Milkman by Anna Burns, which is a novel about the Troubles, and I do think that these two books complement and reinforce each other really well. But unlike Milkman, which I would push into the hands of anybody and which is both rooted in but also transcends its subject matter, I would really only recommend Say Nothing to someone who was specifically interested in learning more about the Troubles. It's an extremely well-written and well-researched book, but I think that shifting back and forth between the two narratives kind of detracts a little bit from both of them, so that it isn't a fully compelling true crime story and also isn't a particularly focused character study of these paramilitary kids. And I think I also just wanted Radden Keefe's analysis and interpretation, especially regarding how these two stories ultimately come back together, to just go a little bit deeper somehow. At one point in the Dolores Price story, he touches on the question of what it means to fight and kill and be ready to die for a belief system, and what it means then to have that struggle just kind of crumble and fall away right under your feet, and potentially maybe mean very little in the long run. What does that do to a person? I found that in particular very interesting, and I think I just wish the rest of the book had been a little bit more focused on questions like that. And last, but definitely not least, I have Ship of Magic and The Mad Ship by Robin Hobb, which are the first two books in her Liveship Traders trilogy. And basically, I've been hearing about Robin Hobb on Booktube for several years now, from people like Mercedes at Mercy's Bookish Musings, Jennifer at Insert Literary Pun, and Chris at Chris Bookish Cauldron. And I've often heard them describe her books as very literary fantasy with really wonderful writing and beautiful character development. So I've always been kind of intrigued by her books, but I've never really been a fantasy reader. Even as a kid, I think the only fantasy series I read in full was Harry Potter, and I don't think I've ever read high fantasy or epic fantasy at all. But then, for like whatever reason, when Game of Thrones was ending last spring, I got this sudden urge for the first time in my life to read something big and epic and magical. And I don't even like watch Game of Thrones, I just consume it through cultural osmosis. But I knew that I didn't want to read those books because there was no way I was going to try fantasy and start reading a series that like may never be finished. So I decided to finally see what Robin Hobb was about, and I decided to start with the Liveship Traders trilogy just because I've heard really, really good things about them, and I've also heard that they have particularly good female characters. So I read Ship of Magic, the first book in the series, at the start of the summer, and I really loved it, like genuinely loved it. And then I waited a couple of months and read The Mad Ship at the end of the summer, and I loved that one even more. So I'm getting ready and gearing up to read Ship of Destiny, the last book in the series, and that's all I want to say about it for now. Once I'm done with the whole series, I want to do a full video about it and also talk about reading fantasy for the first time as an adult, because as much as I think it's true that genres are so often murky and made up and just kind of a matter of marketing, I also felt a kind of joy and exhilaration exhilaration in reading these books that I haven't really felt since I was a kid. And it was certainly a different kind of joy and satisfaction than I typically get from reading a really good literary fiction novel. So stay tuned for more on that, because I think it's worth thinking about and discussing. But until then, those are all the books I've been reading lately. I'm hoping to round this year out with some stronger books than the ones I've been picking lately, and hopefully some slightly more frequent reviews and discussion videos as well. Although I think I've also kind of accepted that this has just been a kind of uneven year on the whole. Hopefully in a few months' time, everything will be kind of more settled and chilled out. But until then, I'm just gonna keeping on. So if you have thoughts on any of those books or on the latest season of Love Island, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I am down to discuss all of the above. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!